To millions of wrestling fans around the world, he was known as the King, the 8-time NWA World Heavyweight Champion. But to every single person who ever crossed paths with Harley Race outside the ring, he was something else entirely. He was the most terrifying human being they had ever encountered. Harley Race didn't walk around looking for trouble. In fact, most of the time, he was described as a man of deep loyalty, fierce generosity, and a quiet, commanding presence that filled a room without him ever having to raise his voice. But when something crossed that invisible line, when someone threatened his livelihood, disrespected the business, or put their hands on someone who couldn't defend themselves, the transformation was instantaneous and absolutely devastating. In this video, we count down the top 5 times Harley Race snapped. Real-life, unscripted moments when the Missouri-born brawler showed the world exactly why every wrestler from that era named him as one of the 3 most legitimately dangerous men to ever lace up a pair of boots. We're talking about incidents that involved weapons, bloodshed, and the kind of violence that belongs in a war zone, not a wrestling locker room. And by the time we reach number 1, you'll hear all about one fateful night when Harley Race confronted the most powerful man in wrestling history, put him to sleep with his bare hands, and very nearly changed the course of professional wrestling forever. But before we get to that, you need to understand something about where Harley Race came from, because that's the only way any of this makes sense. Harley Leland Race was born on April 11, 1943, in Quitman, Missouri. A tiny speck of a town in the rural Ozarks, the kind of place where people worked the land from sunup to sundown and measured a man's worth by the calluses on his hands. His family were sharecroppers, poor, hardworking, and tough in the way that only people who have nothing can be tough, because they've got nothing left to lose. As a child, Race battled and survived polio. Think about that for a moment. Before he ever threw a punch, before he ever stepped inside a wrestling ring, this kid was fighting for his life against a disease that crippled and killed thousands. He beat it. And that experience seemed to install something in him. A refusal to accept defeat under any circumstances. A stubbornness that bordered on the supernatural. As a teenager, Race found his way to a farm owned by Stanislaus and Władek Zbyszko, 2 legendary wrestlers from the early 20th century who had retired to rural Missouri. In exchange for backbreaking manual labor, plowing fields, hauling equipment, the kind of work that builds grip strength and endurance that no gym can replicate, the Zbyszko brothers trained young Harley in the art of wrestling. And their methods were not gentle. They would put Race in submission holds and leave him there. Make him figure his own way out. Teach him through pain that there was always a way to survive if you wanted it badly enough. By 15, Race was already 6'1" and well over 200 pounds. He was wrestling in Carnival exhibitions, taking on local tough guys for prize money. Farmers, bar brawlers, anyone who thought they could take the kid. If Race lost, he didn't get paid. So he learned quickly how to win. And when some mean old farmer had him on the ropes for real, Race would simply smash his forehead into their nose and collect his money. At 16, he got into a fight at school with another classmate. The principal tried to break it up by kneeing Race in the back of the head. That was a mistake. Race turned around and beat the principal senseless. He was expelled immediately. Given the option to apologize and return to school, Race chose to leave and pursue wrestling full-time. He never looked back. At just 18 years old, tragedy struck. Race married his first wife, Vivian Jones, on November 14, 1961. She was pregnant with their first child. Just over 5 weeks later, on December 26th, the day after Christmas, they were driving through a snowstorm near Maryville, Missouri, when a tractor trailer jackknifed across their lane. The impact was catastrophic. Both Harley and Vivian were pronounced dead at the scene. Vivian and their unborn child never regained consciousness. But somehow, against all logic, Harley showed a flicker of life in the ambulance. He woke up days later in a hospital bed. His wife was gone, his child was gone, and the doctors were preparing to amputate his right leg. That's when promoter Gus Karras, the man who had given Race his start in the business, came storming into the hospital and declared that the amputation would happen over his dead body. A specialist was brought in. The leg was saved. But Race was told he would never walk again, let alone wrestle. He was back in the ring within 2 years. That's who Harley Race was. A man who was literally pronounced dead and came back. A man who was told he'd never walk and went on to become an 8-time world champion. A man forged in poverty, grief, and physical agony who transformed all of that suffering into something unstoppable. At his peak, Race stood 6'1" and weighed around 253 pounds. Not the biggest guy in the room, but it was the density of his build, the crushing grip strength developed from years of farm labor and wrestling training, and the absolute fearlessness that came from having already survived the worst life could throw at him. Wrestlers who shook his hand said it was like putting your fingers in a hydraulic press. His headbutt was legendary, a weapon he developed in those carnival days that could drop any man on the planet. And his pain tolerance was essentially non-existent because he simply didn't register discomfort the way normal people do. Ric Flair, who knew Race better than almost anyone, once called him the toughest man in the history of the sport. Bob Roop, a former Olympic wrestler, said that if he was in the most dangerous situation of his life surrounded by enemies with no way out, the one man he would want standing beside him was Harley Race. Not Andre the Giant. Not any of the famous shooters or submission specialists. Harley Race. Because Race wouldn't just fight alongside you. He would go through the wall to get to you. So with that context in mind, let's start with number 5. And a story that proves Harley Race was born fighting and never stopped. Number 5. The Carnival Days and the Art of the Headbutt. Before Harley Race was a world champion, before he ever appeared on national television, he was a teenage carnival wrestler in the rural Midwest. And the stories from those days read like something out of a different century, because in many ways, they were. The carnival circuit worked like this. A professional wrestler would set up in a tent at a county fair or traveling show and issue an open challenge. Anyone from the crowd could step into the ring. If you could last a certain amount of time or if you could pin the wrestler, you won the prize money. The carnival always had a plant in the crowd, a guy who looked like a local but was actually a trained wrestler to make sure the show went smoothly. Race served as that plant for a while, but he also served as the carnival champion himself. And when he was the champion, it was a shoot, a real fight. No script, no cooperation, just Race versus whatever local tough guy was feeling brave that night. He would fight 5 or 6 strangers a night, farmers built like oak trees, bar brawlers with nothing to lose, ex-military guys looking to prove something. And Race had to beat all of them, because if he lost, he didn't get paid. This is where the headbutt became his signature weapon. When some legitimately dangerous opponent had Race in trouble, when brute strength alone wasn't going to be enough, Race would launch his forehead directly into their face. The impact was devastating. Years of doing this had essentially calcified his skull into something approaching a battering ram. The bone above his eyebrows was so thick and dense that hitting it was like hitting a cinder block. Eddie Sharkey, a fellow wrestler who was there during those early days, remembered one incident when a fan jumped Race at a show. Race responded with a real-life eye gouge that sent the man screaming. When asked about it later, Sharkey simply shrugged and said that Harley could be a street fighter when he needed to be. This wasn't wrestling as entertainment. This was survival. And it laid the foundation for everything that came after. Every bar fight, every backstage confrontation, every moment when Harley Race looked danger in the face and chose violence. It all started in those carnival tents where a teenage kid from nowhere learned that his head was the most devastating weapon in any room. There's a specific incident from a show in Denver that Eddie Sharkey has talked about. Race was working a match, doing his job, playing the heel, getting the crowd riled up, and the fans did what fans in those days sometimes did. They piled onto him. Not one guy, a group of them. They swarmed him. And in the chaos, one of them bit Race's finger, actually clamped down on his hand with his teeth. Race's response was instant and brutal. A real-life eye gouge. Not the gentle, theatrical kind you see on television. The kind where your fingers go somewhere they're never supposed to go. The fan learned a lesson that night about the difference between a wrestling character and the man playing him. The carnival days didn't just make Race tough, they made him something fundamentally different from the wrestlers who came after him. He wasn't performing violence, he was practicing it. Night after night, against real opponents with real consequences. While other wrestlers learned their craft in training schools and gymnasiums, Race learned his in the most unforgiving environment imaginable. An environment where losing meant not eating. Where every opponent was an unknown quantity. Where the only rules were the ones you could enforce with your fists and your forehead. Years later, when Race was champion and traveling the world, this carnival background gave him something that no amount of athletic training could replicate. He had what old-timers called a shooter's instinct. He could read a situation instantly and react with the kind of decisive violence that ended confrontations before they even really began. It's why wrestlers like Bruiser Brody and Stan Hansen, who were famous for being dangerously stiff workers who wouldn't sell for anybody, would ease up and cooperate when they worked with Harley Race. Because they knew. If Race decided to shoot on them, to make it real, there was nothing they could do about it. He would hurt them, and he wouldn't feel bad about it afterward. That reputation, earned in carnival tents and rural fairgrounds before Race was old enough to legally drive, would follow him for the rest of his life. And it would save him more times than anyone could count. And that difference would become terrifyingly apparent as his career progressed. Number 4. The Chestnut Tree stabbing and the retaliation. This incident happened in 1965, when Race was just 22 years old and already making a name for himself in the AWA alongside tag team partner Larry Hennig. It's a story that Ric Flair himself has told multiple times over the years, because it was the first story he ever heard about Harley Race. And it was the story that made him understand exactly what kind of man he was dealing with. Race was having dinner at a place called the Chestnut Tree, a restaurant in Minneapolis. It was a normal evening: food, drinks, conversation. And then Race noticed something at another table. A man was getting physical with a woman, slapping her, grabbing her. The kind of behavior that makes most people uncomfortable, but that they choose to ignore because getting involved is dangerous. Harley Race was not most people. He stood up, he walked over, and he knocked the man unconscious with a single punch. One blow. The guy went down like a sack of concrete. Problem solved. Or so Race thought. What Race didn't know was that the man had a friend named John Morton, and Morton had a knife. While Race's attention was on the unconscious man, Morton stabbed Harley Race in the back. Race went down. He was rushed to the hospital. According to Ric Flair, Race walked into the emergency room with the knife still embedded in his body. They pulled it out and patched him up. Morton was arrested. And for most people, that would have been the end of the story. A traumatic experience. A lesson learned about getting involved in other people's problems. But Harley Race was not most people. A few months later, Race got his retaliation. According to Ric Flair's version of events, Race shot out all the windows of a barbecue place called Cal's Barbecue and got arrested for it. But when Trevor Murdoch asked Race about the weapon years later, Race corrected him. Murdoch had assumed it was a handgun. Race told him it wasn't a pistol. It was a machine gun. The fact that Race escalated the detail rather than downplayed it told Murdoch everything he needed to know. This wasn't a tall tale. This was Harley Race. Flair remembered reading about it in the Minneapolis newspaper. It was front page news. That was Ric Flair's introduction to the legend of Harley Race. A front page story about a wrestler who got stabbed in a bar fight and responded by shooting up a building. The Chestnut Tree incident established something that would define Race for the rest of his life. He had a code. You don't put your hands on people who can't defend themselves. And if someone put their hands on him, there would be consequences. Not immediate consequences necessarily. Race was patient. He could wait weeks, he could wait months, but the consequences would come. They were inevitable, as certain as gravity. And they would be disproportionate. That's what separated Race from your average bar brawler. A bar brawler swings in the heat of the moment. Race planned his retribution with the patience of a man who had all the time in the world and absolutely zero interest in forgiveness. He kept score. And he settled every debt. That's what made him so terrifying to the people who knew him. You could wrong Harley Race today and feel safe for months. And then one day, you'd hear that sound. A car pulling up outside. A knock on the door. Or in this case, gunfire. Number 3. The Hells Angels biker confrontation. In the early 1980s, Harley Race was one of the biggest wrestling stars on the planet. An 8-time NWA World Heavyweight Champion. a main eventer in every territory he worked, and the kind of performer whose heel work was so convincing, so real, that fans genuinely wanted to hurt him. Which brings us to Eugene, Oregon, and a group of bikers who made the worst decision of their lives. During a show in Eugene, a gang of bikers who resembled Hell's Angels members began heckling Race relentlessly from the crowd. Not just booing, challenging him, threatening him, telling him that they could take him in a real fight, that wrestling was fake and they were going to prove it. Race ignored them during the show. He was a professional. He knew how to work a crowd and he knew how to separate the performance from reality. But after the show ended, the bikers didn't leave. They lingered around the building, waiting, still running their mouths, still looking for a fight. Harley Race decided to give them one. He emerged from the building and surveyed the group. There were several of them. Big guys, leather jackets, the kind of men who were used to intimidating people. Race looked them over and made a decision. He picked the biggest one. He walked up to the man and gave him a warning. He told him plainly that if he got in the ring, he was going to get hurt. The biker didn't care. He was adamant. He wanted to fight. What happened next took approximately 3 seconds. The biker lunged at Race. Race responded by launching his forehead directly into the man's face. That legendary headbutt, the one that had been perfected through hundreds of carnival bouts and thousands of hours of real combat. His forehead connected with the biker's nose with a sound like concrete hitting an egg. The nose shattered. Blood exploded from the man's nostrils in a crimson river. But Race wasn't done. As the biker staggered, Race grabbed him and locked in a cross-face sleeper hold. A real one. Not a wrestling move designed to look good on television. A blood choke that cut off circulation to the brain. The biker's eyes rolled back. His body went limp, and Harley Race held him there, unconscious and bleeding, right in front of all his friends, letting them watch their toughest guy go to sleep. Onlookers thought the biker was dead. The other bikers, the ones who had been so brave and so loud just minutes earlier, suddenly wanted nothing to do with Harley Race. They backed away. They collected their unconscious friend. And they left, without another word. Because they had just watched their biggest, baddest member get destroyed in less time than it takes to sneeze, and they understood on a primal level that going after Race would end the same way. The biker confrontation is significant because it demonstrates something important about Race's approach to violence. He didn't lose control. He didn't fly into a rage. He assessed the situation, identified the most effective target, issued a warning, and then delivered a precise, devastating response. It was clinical, it was efficient, and it was absolutely terrifying. Number 2. The Kansas City confrontation with Hulk Hogan. This is one of the most famous stories in wrestling history, and it involves Harley Race doing something that very few people have ever done. He stood up to the entire World Wrestling Federation machine and threatened to destroy its biggest star. The year was 1984, possibly early 1985. Vince McMahon's World Wrestling Federation was in the process of going national, invading territory after territory, stealing talent, and systematically destroying the system that had governed professional wrestling for decades. For Race, this wasn't just business, this was personal. He was a part owner of the Kansas City territory, heart of America's sports attractions, and McMahon's expansion was killing it. Race would eventually lose over $500,000 as an owner. When McMahon began pumping WWE programming into Kansas City, Harley Race's home turf, promoting Hulk Hogan as the real world's champion, Race snapped. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about honor, about legacy, about respect for the traditions and agreements that had governed the wrestling business for generations. The night that World Wrestling Federation came to Kansas City for a live event, Race left his own NWA show, where Ric Flair was working against Bruiser Brody in front of 3,000 people, and headed across town with a gun tucked into his waistband. Flair himself has told this story. He remembers Race pulling out his weapon and announcing his intentions. He was going over to the convention center to deal with Hogan. Flair was left standing there, watching one of the most dangerous men in wrestling walk out the door with a loaded firearm and murder on his mind. According to multiple accounts, Race arrived at the WWE venue before the show started. The ring crew later told Hogan that Race had already been there and had tried to set the ring on fire. When told that Hogan hadn't arrived yet, Race left. But he came back. Hogan, who had been warned about Race's intentions, arrived late and tried to avoid the confrontation by putting his match low on the card instead of in the main event slot. He went across the street to a restaurant called the Rusty Scupper, drank 2 bottles of wine, and tried to calm his nerves. Eventually, he had to go back to the arena. What happened next depends on which version you believe, and multiple people have told it. In one version, Race found Hogan in the locker room, punched him hard in the ribs, and sent him flying backward into a chair. Hogan, trying to defuse the situation, made a nervous joke. He told Race that he figured the first time he saw him in Kansas City, he'd have a great big gun. Race's response was chilling. He told Hogan that he didn't have a great big one. Then he calmly pulled out a .38 caliber handgun. Hogan scrambled out of the room as fast as his legs could carry him. In another version, told by Hogan on the Joe Rogan Experience, Race caught him coming out of the bathroom with a gun in his hand and told him he'd come there to blow his kneecaps off, but had decided he'd rather work with him instead. Regardless of which details are exactly right, the core facts are consistent across every telling. Harley Race showed up at a WWE event with a loaded firearm. He confronted Hulk Hogan. He made it clear that he was prepared to use violence, and every single person who was there believed, without a shadow of a doubt, that Harley Race would have pulled that trigger if the situation had gone differently. Hogan himself was terrified. This wasn't a wrestling angle. This wasn't a work. This was a man with a gun, and decades of real-world violence behind him, who felt that everything he had built was being stolen from him. And he was angry enough to do something about it. The Kansas City incident reveals the fire that burned inside Harley Race. This was a man who had survived being pronounced dead, who had fought his way back from a shattered leg, who had clawed his way to the top of the wrestling world through 2 decades of blood, sweat, and sacrifice. And he was watching it all get torn away by a New York businessman who didn't respect the traditions or the people who had built the industry. You have to understand what Kansas City meant to Harley Race. This wasn't just another city on the tour. This was his home, his territory, the place where he had invested his money, his time, and his reputation into building something real. Heart of America. Sports attractions wasn't just a business to him. It was his legacy. The thing he was building for his family's future, and McMahon was systematically destroying it by pumping WWE programming into the market and luring away the audience Race had spent years cultivating. When Race saw Hogan being promoted as the real world's champion, being paraded through his territory like a conquering hero, something inside him broke. This wasn't just competition. This was disrespect. This was a man with a briefcase full of money telling Harley Race that everything he had built, everything he had bled for, everything he had sacrificed his body and his first marriage and his financial security for, was worthless. Race would eventually lose over $500,000 as an owner of the Kansas City territory. $500,000. Gone. Because Vince McMahon decided that the rules didn't apply to him. In the end, Race didn't shoot anyone. The situation was resolved, at least temporarily. But the message was delivered. Harley Race was not a man to be trifled with, not by bikers, not by bar patrons, and certainly not by the biggest wrestling promotion on the planet. And speaking of confronting the most powerful man in wrestling, that brings us to number 1, a story that's been documented by multiple eyewitnesses, confirmed by Race's own family, and covered on Dark Side of the Ring. A story about the one time Harley Race got his hands on Vince McMahon himself. Number 1, putting Vince McMahon to sleep. This is the incident that sits at the absolute pinnacle of Harley Race's legendary history of real-life confrontations. The moment when the toughest man in wrestling history went face-to-face with the most powerful man in wrestling history. It was November 1983. Starrcade, the NWA's biggest annual event, was just days away. The main event was set. Harley Race was going to drop the NWA World Heavyweight Championship to Ric Flair in a steel cage match on November 24th in Greensboro, North Carolina. It was going to be the crowning moment of Flair's career, the passing of the torch, the event that would establish Flair as the man for the next decade. Vince McMahon saw an opportunity to destroy all of it. McMahon contacted Race and arranged a meeting. When Race arrived, McMahon made his pitch: $250,000. All Race had to do was no-show Starrcade, bring the NWA World Championship belt to the WWE, and let McMahon's chosen champion, Hulk Hogan, unify the titles. In one move, McMahon would have killed the NWA and cemented the WWE as the only game in town. $250,000. In 1983 money, that was a fortune. More than most wrestlers would make in years. And McMahon was offering it in cash for one simple act of betrayal. Race looked McMahon in the eye and turned him down. He said he wouldn't be able to look at himself in the mirror. He had given his word to the NWA. He had agreed to drop the title to Flair. And Harley Race's word meant more to him than any amount of money. The business had given him everything. It had taken him from a sharecropper's shack in Missouri to the top of the world. And he was not going to repay that by stabbing it in the back for a payday. McMahon, according to most people, accepted the decision gracefully. That's the polite version. But in Race's own autobiography, King of the Ring, and in accounts from his family members on Dark Side of the Ring, what happened next was anything but graceful. As the two men were leaving, possibly exiting a bathroom according to some versions, Vince McMahon attacked Harley Race from behind. McMahon dove at Race's legs. A leg dive. A wrestling takedown attempt. Whether this was genuine anger, competitive instinct, or some misguided attempt to prove his own toughness, McMahon physically attacked the reigning NWA World Heavyweight Champion. Now, Vince McMahon was no pushover. He was a big man, athletic, known for his physical courage and his willingness to mix it up, but he had just made the worst miscalculation of his life. Race stuffed the takedown. He sprawled, caught his balance, and immediately got McMahon's neck. He hooked his arms, cinched in a choke, and squeezed. A real choke, not a wrestling move. The kind of hold that cuts off blood to the brain and puts a man to sleep in seconds if applied correctly. And Harley Race applied it correctly. McMahon's body went limp. His eyes closed. Out cold on the floor of that hotel. Harley Race, at that moment, had the most powerful man in professional wrestling completely at his mercy. Race's wife, who was present during the meeting, later told Dark Side of the Ring that Harley told her afterward that he wished he had wrung McMahon's neck, because McMahon was in the process of putting the NWA out of business, and Race had the chance to stop it right there. Race's son revealed a similar sentiment. His father told him years later that he could have snapped McMahon's neck right there if he had wanted to. That the position he had McMahon in, it would have taken barely any additional pressure to end it permanently. Race released the hold. McMahon woke up, and the two men went their separate ways. Race went to Greensboro and dropped the NWA Championship to Ric Flair at Starrcade on November 24th, in a bloody cage match with Gene Kiniski serving as the special referee. He honored his word. He did the right thing. And McMahon went on to build his empire. To destroy the territories one by one. To create the wrestling monopoly that exists to this day. Everything that Race feared would happen, happened. The NWA crumbled. The territories died. The system that had governed professional wrestling for generations was swept away. But Harley Race walked out of that hotel room with something that Vince McMahon could never buy: his integrity, his honor, and the knowledge that when push came to shove, literally, he had proven who the tougher man was. The Vince McMahon incident stands as the defining moment of Harley Race's legend because it contains everything: the physical dominance, the moral conviction, the refusal to compromise his principles for money or power, and the restraint to stop short of going too far, even when he had every reason and every opportunity to do so. Harley Race could have changed the course of wrestling history that night. He could have ended Vince McMahon, and nobody in that room could have stopped him. He chose not to, not out of weakness, not out of fear, but because even in his most dangerous moment, Harley Race had a code, and that code meant more to him than revenge. What becomes clear when you look at all these incidents together is that there was always a principle at stake. Race didn't attack people randomly. He wasn't a bully. He wasn't a loose cannon looking for excuses to hurt people. Every single one of these incidents was triggered by a violation of the code that Harley Race lived by. That code was simple. You don't put your hands on people who can't defend themselves. You honor your word. You respect the business that feeds you. And if someone crosses those lines, you deal with it directly, face to face, man to man. No excuses, no hesitation, no mercy. Bobby Heenan, who managed Race during his WWE years, confirmed what everyone in the business already knew. Andre the Giant, the eighth wonder of the world, feared exactly two men, Harley Race and Haku. Think about that. The biggest, most physically dominant figure in wrestling history was afraid of a 6'1" man from rural Missouri. That's because Andre understood something that casual observers couldn't see. Size doesn't determine who wins a fight. Will does. And Harley Race had more will than any human being Andre had ever encountered. When Harley Race was in the locker room, everyone behaved. Everyone followed the rules. Everyone showed respect. Not because they were afraid of losing their job, but because they had seen what happened when you disrespected Harley Race. They had heard the stories, and they knew with absolute certainty that some men should never be provoked. Now, there's one more story worth mentioning. A story that didn't quite make the top 5, but that perfectly captures the duality of who Harley Race was. The famous CM Punk milk story. Punk, who is famously straight edge and doesn't drink alcohol, was at a bar for Harley Race's birthday celebration. Race had bought shots for everyone in attendance. When the server brought Punk a shot, Punk politely declined. The server insisted, "You don't turn down a drink from Harley Race." Race himself intervened. He told the server it was fine. Punk didn't have to drink. No pressure, no judgment. Just quiet respect for another man's choices. Punk, touched by the gesture, decided to return the favor. He bought a round of shots for the entire bar, shots of milk. Nobody wanted to drink them. But then Harley Race picked up his shot glass of milk, looked around the room, and drank it. Without hesitation. Without complaint. And suddenly, every single person in that bar was drinking their milk. Because if Harley Race was drinking milk, you were drinking milk. That's who Harley Race was in a single story. Tough enough to terrify everyone in the room. Respectful enough to honor another man's principles. And commanding enough that a room full of grown men would drink shots of milk because he did it first. The wrestling business has changed completely since Harley Race's heyday. The territories are gone. The Carnival exhibitions are ancient history. The days when a wrestler had to be able to defend the championship for real, to physically prevent someone from stealing the belt in a double cross, are over. The locker room has policies and HR departments and corporate oversight. But every once in a while, when an old-timer starts telling stories about the way things used to be, about the men who built this business with their bare hands and defended it with their blood, Harley Race's name is the first one that comes up. Because he was the real deal. A carnival fighter who became a world champion. A man who was pronounced dead and came back to life. A man who survived stabbings, car wrecks, and confrontations with armed opponents. A man who put the most powerful figure in wrestling to sleep with his bare hands and had the integrity to let him wake up. Ric Flair said it best. Without Harley Race, there was no Ric Flair. And that's not just a wrestling statement. That's a statement about what it means to be the standard. The measuring stick. The man that everyone else has to measure themselves against. They don't make them like Harley Race anymore. The mold didn't just break. It was forged in fire, tempered in tragedy, and hardened by a lifetime of violence that would have destroyed any lesser man. But it didn't destroy Harley Race. Nothing could destroy Harley Race. Not polio, not a knife in his back, not Vince McMahon's money, not the march of time itself. He died on August 1st, 2019 at the age of 76. Lung cancer finally did what no man, no biker gang, and no billionaire promoter ever could. But even at the end, he was fighting. Because that's all Harley Race ever knew how to do. In his final years, Race ran the Harley Race Wrestling Academy in Eldon, Missouri, training the next generation. Trevor Murdoch, who became one of Race's most devoted students, spoke of him with the kind of reverence usually reserved for fathers and generals. He said that when Harley was feeling good, when you caught that brief window where the old Harley came through, it was like standing in the presence of something mythical. Something that the stories didn't quite capture. Something you had to experience to believe. Mick Foley, who worked closely with Race during his WCW years managing Vader, said that Harley respected him but thought he was crazy. The feeling was mutual. Foley, a man famous for jumping off cages and taking chair shots to the skull, looked at Harley Race and recognized a fellow traveler on the road of deliberate self-destruction. But where Foley chose to absorb punishment, Race chose to deliver it. And there was never any question about which approach was more effective. Jim Cornette summed it up as well as anyone ever has. He said there was probably nobody in the history of wrestling that gave more of themselves physically, more of their effort, more of their determination, and more of their credibility than Harley Race did. Every night, every match, every handshake, every confrontation. He gave everything he had because he didn't know how to give anything less. Steve Austin, who developed a close friendship with Race during their time together in WCW, understood something about Harley that many people missed. He understood that the toughness wasn't the point. The toughness was just the tool. What made Harley Race special was the conviction behind it. The unshakable belief that this business, this art form, this way of life was worth protecting at any cost. The toughness was just how he protected it. And maybe that's the real legacy of Harley Race. Not the broken noses or the gunfights or the unconscious bodies left in his wake. Those are just the symptoms of something deeper. The real legacy is the principle that a man's word matters, that loyalty matters, that standing up for people who can't stand up for themselves matters, and that sometimes the only way to defend those principles is with your bare hands and an iron will. Like and subscribe for more hard-hitting wrestling documentaries. Until next time.